What if the most important work of your life is simply to be fully present for it? Have you ever wondered why joy and sorrow seem to arrive together, like old friends never far apart? Or why the smallest, quietest moments, like the smell of an old scarf or the way sunlight touches your hand, hold more meaning than anything you ever chased? Maybe life was never meant to be solved. Maybe it was only ever meant to be felt. If those questions stir something in you, then you're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to Mindful Footsteps, a space where we walk slowly, speak softly, and listen deeply to life, to memory, to the wisdom already within you. Here, we don't chase answers, we return to presence. If the words you hear today bring you peace or clarity, consider liking this video. If something resonates, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your reflection. And if your heart feels called, subscribe to Mindful Footsteps and continue this quiet journey with us. Now take a breath. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Memory in the Palm of the Hand. The Sacredness of Objects. Have you ever looked at something seemingly ordinary? A button, a photograph, a folded piece of paper, and felt your breath catch for a moment as if your heart remembered something before your mind did? In a monastery many years ago, I asked a novice why he kept a small stone by his sleeping mat. He looked at me, not with the innocence of a child, but with the awareness of one who had just begun to awaken. He said, "It was the first stone I touched when I arrived here. It reminds me. I chose this path. Isn't it fascinating how the smallest things often hold the loudest echoes? We tend to think memory is held in the mind, but often it is our hands that remember first. The touch of a worn-out scarf, the weight of a father's watch, the warmth of a letter yellowed with time. Why do we keep these things? Are they sacred? Or are we simply too sentimental? But what if sentimentality is not weakness, but reverence? In Buddhist understanding, attachment is known to lead to suffering. Yes, that is true. But detachment does not mean discarding love. It means learning to love more wisely. Sometimes, keeping an object is not clinging. It's a quiet ceremony, a way of saying, "This mattered. This passed through my life with meaning." One morning, I met an elderly woman who brought tea to our temple gate every day. Her hands were tired, her breath slow. That day, I noticed a faded photograph beside the cup. I asked, "Who is this?" She smiled with tears in her voice. "My husband. He drinks with me." Still, can you feel that? That's not grief. That's devotion that outlives time. Let me ask you, what object do you keep that others might call junk, but to you is priceless? Is it tucked in a drawer, kept in a box? Or perhaps you wear it close to your skin? Even the powerful understand this. Did you know that President Barack Obama carried with him a handful of small tokens, trinkets given by strangers during his campaigns? A bracelet, a rosary, a tiny Buddha. When asked why, he said, "They remind me of the people I serve." These objects aren't magical, but they are meaningful. They are mirrors. They reflect back to us our values, our relationships, and who we've chosen to become. I once met a former soldier who carried a pebble in his coat pocket. Not a medal, not a picture, a pebble. He said, "It was stuck in my boot during a march in the war. I hated it then, but I never threw it away. Every time I feel it now, I remember I made it through." So I ask you, what have you kept, not for its beauty, but for what it witnessed? What whispers to you of who you were and who you are still becoming? Would you be willing to share it in the comments below? Tell us your story, not the object's story, yours. Because someone out there might need to know they're not the only one still carrying love in a box under the bed. You see, these things we keep, they're not clutter. They are portals. They are threads in the sacred fabric of your becoming. And when we honor them, we're not resisting impermanence. We're bowing to it. And perhaps that's the lesson. Not to throw everything away in pursuit of spiritual minimalism, but to ask, gently, what is this helping me remember? Chapter 2. Joy and Grief, Two Wings of the Same Bird. The Buddha taught that life is suffering. But to understand his words fully, we must read not only with the mind, but with the heart. He did not mean life is only suffering. He meant that suffering is woven into life, just as surely as joy, wonder, and love. Have you ever laughed at a funeral? Not out of disrespect, but because the memory of someone you lost was so vivid, so beautiful, it made your heart overflow? That is not confusion. That is wholeness. Aging teaches us this paradox more clearly than any book or sermon. That joy and grief are not opposites. They are partners. Each expands our capacity to feel the other. The deeper the sorrow, the more space the heart makes for joy. I remember sitting with a woman in her 70s. She had lost her husband of 45 years. Her eyes were soft, but filled with pain. She said, "The pain is unbearable, but it reminds me how deeply we loved." There was no bitterness in her voice, only gratitude disguised as grief. Think about that for a moment. What if your pain isn't punishment, but proof that you've lived and loved and let yourself feel? A young mother once shared this with me. Her son had just been diagnosed with terminal cancer. 1 week after the diagnosis, they were watching old cartoons together when something silly made them both burst out laughing. It wasn't forced. It wasn't ironic. It was real. She told me, "That day, we were more alive than ever. I don't know how. I just know we were." What if grief is not the end of joy, but the door that makes it sacred? We live in a culture that often tells us to pick sides. Be happy or be heartbroken, be strong or be vulnerable. But the heart, your heart, was made to hold both. The tears and the laughter, the ache and the light. Ask yourself, have you ever had a moment so bittersweet that you couldn't tell whether you were crying or smiling? That's not a contradiction. That's presence. And presence is where the soul begins to wake up. There's an old teaching in Buddhism. Suffering is not a mistake. It's a path, a teacher. And if we stop trying to escape it, if we stop numbing it or pushing it away, it transforms us. Because when grief is welcomed, it becomes tenderness. And when joy arrives unexpectedly, perhaps in the middle of heartbreak, it becomes a kind of sacred defiance, a way of saying, yes, life is hard, and still, I am here, I am breathing, I am capable of love. So, let me ask you, what moment of deep pain has also cracked you open to something beautiful? What loss made you feel more alive, not less? And what if the work of your soul isn't to fix what hurts, but to feel it fully, and let it deepen your love for everything that remains? Joy and grief are not in competition. They are two wings of the same bird. And only when we stop fighting one can we finally soar with both. Chapter 3. Strength. Not asked for, but chosen. Anyway, strength is not always a roar. Often, it arrives as a whisper, steady, quiet, almost invisible to the world outside. It comes in the moment you choose to rise again, not because you're ready, but because you have no other choice. There's a kind of sacred strength born not from pride, but from responsibility, especially for caregivers, those who must carry not only their own sorrow, but the lives of others. Strength is discovered in the fire of necessity. I remember sitting with a man named Thomas. His wife had passed away suddenly, and their daughter was only 6 years old at the time. He told me, "I didn't know how to do it. I was broken." But I looked at her little face and I realized if I didn't stand up, she would fall with me. So he stood for her. And in doing so, without even knowing it, he began to stand for the part of himself that had long been abandoned. The child within him, quiet, unseen, needing comfort, was finally being held, not by someone else, but by the man he had become. You see, in Buddhist practice, we are reminded again and again, true strength does not come from conquest. It does not come from overpowering, dominating, or forcing outcomes. It comes from compassion. It comes from the willingness to stay, to show up, to hold space, even when you're exhausted, even when you're afraid. Sometimes strength looks like carrying someone else's burden, and sometimes it looks like forgiving yourself for not being able to carry it all. I think of figures like Nelson Mandela, who emerged from decades of imprisonment not with vengeance, but with grace. His strength wasn't born in power, it was born in endurance, in holding on to dignity in the face of despair. So let me ask you this. When in your life have you kept going, not for your own sake, but for someone you love? Who did you carry when you were the one who needed to be carried? And can you see now, in hindsight, that what you called weakness at the time was actually love in motion? You don't need to feel strong to be strong. Strength is not always felt. Sometimes it's only recognized later, when you look back and realize you never gave up. And that too is sacred. Chapter 4. The wisdom of stillness. Don't panic. Remember who you are. There are two teachings I offer more than any others. I have whispered them to the grieving, the heartbroken, the lost, the dying, and still, they remain as powerful today as when I first learned them. Don't panic. Remember who you are. These may sound simple, too simple, but in the middle of chaos, it's not complexity we crave. It's clarity, a thread to hold on to in the dark. I once met a woman whose life had unraveled all at once. Divorce, illness, financial collapse. She brought me a small piece of cloth, embroidered by her mother who had passed years earlier. On it were those words, "Don't panic. Remember who you are." She said, "I've lost everything. But this cloth is my temple." It wasn't the fabric that gave her strength, it was the truth behind it. In Buddhist tradition, we speak of equanimity, a state of inner calm that doesn't depend on outer conditions. It is the ability to breathe even when the wind howls. It is the still point at the center of the storm. So let me ask you, what anchors you when everything else falls away? Do you have a phrase, a memory, a presence that reminds you? You've been through storms before, and you're still here? The world will try to name you by your failures, your past, your appearance, your mistakes. But those are not your name. You are not your resume. You are not your pain. You are not your age, or your illness, or your regrets. You are the quiet awareness behind all of it. You are the breath that keeps rising. You are the stillness beneath the noise. I think of Maya Angelou, who once said, "You may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated." Her strength didn't come from never falling. It came from never forgetting who she was. And now I invite you, just for a moment, place your hand gently over your heart and say aloud, slowly, I am not broken. I am unfolding. Say it again if you need to, because remembering who you are is not a one-time event. It's a daily practice, and in the remembering, we come home. Chapter 5. To be seen is to be healed. Loneliness in old age is rarely about the absence of people. It's about the absence of presence. To be alone is one thing. To be unseen, that is something else entirely. June, a woman in her 80s, once sat across from me with tears in her eyes. She said, "I was never lonelier than when I was surrounded by people who didn't really see me." She wasn't speaking of strangers. She meant family, friends, even caregivers, people who checked boxes but not her pulse. What she longed for wasn't attention. It was acknowledgement. In Buddhist practice, there is a sacred art called deep listening. It is not passive. It is not waiting for your turn to speak. It is being fully present. It means listening not just to words, but to the silences between them. Listening for the grief someone hides behind a smile, the fear beneath their strength, the love buried beneath years of restraint. Have you ever been truly listened to? Not advised? Not judged? Just heard? It can feel like water to a soul that has gone thirsty for years. I recall a young man, once suicidal, who told me the moment that saved him was not a grand intervention. It was a stranger on a park bench who looked at him, asked, "Are you okay?" and waited long enough to hear the real answer. He said, "In that moment, I felt real. I felt seen. I chose to stay." Never underestimate the healing power of your presence. So I ask you, when was the last time you listened without the urge to reply? When you ask someone, "How are you?" do you truly want to know? This is the practice. To pause long enough for someone else's truth to unfold. To give the gift of your full attention, not as a performance, but as an offering. Because when someone feels truly seen, something inside them softens. The walls begin to fall. The heart dares to open. And when you offer that space to another, you create the possibility of healing in both of you. Conclusion: the great return. So, what remains after the stories, the stillness, the sorrow, and the joy? What lingers after the goodbyes, the laughter, the questions we never answered, and the love that never asked to be explained? Maybe. What remains is exactly what has always been waiting beneath the surface. That joy and sorrow are not enemies. They are companions. That strength does not rise from force, but from love that chooses to stay. That to be human is not to be perfect. It is to feel, to remember, to begin again. And that you, dear soul, just as you are enough. The path of aging is not a descent. It is a return to your center, a return to what matters, a quiet unveiling of truths once buried under busyness, expectation, and fear. You're not too late. You're not too much. You're not behind. You are a light still burning. So when the question comes again, why am I here? May you smile softly and answer, to be awake, to love, to feel, and to walk this path with open hands. Because maybe your purpose is not a destination. Maybe it's the way you pause for beauty, the way you offer presence, the way you carry tenderness in a world rushing to forget it. So wherever you are, however you arrive at this moment, may peace find you. And may you remember, the journey never asked you to become someone else. It only ever invited you to come home to who you already are.